Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really diving in right to the very beginning, Genesis 1.
That's right.
But, not just a surface read. We're looking at it through this incredibly rich Jewish lens, using centuries of commentary.
Exactly. We know you, the learner. You're keen to get knowledge quickly, but also thoroughly, right? You like seeing different viewpoints, getting those aha moments.
Without getting totally bogged down. And that's what this is about, unpacking some key interpretations, some big questions around Genesis 1 in Jewish thought.
Mm-hmm. And look, lots of people know Genesis 1 or think they do, but we're going way beyond that simple reading.
We really are. We're digging into how these major Jewish scholars actually understood this foundational text.
Yeah, we've got a great stack of interpretations lined up. Some surprising facts, I think, and just a deeper feel for the nuances in these verses.
Absolutely. We'll be hearing from figures like Abarbanel, Rashi, Rashbam, Ibn Ezra, Kimhi, Nachmanides.
Key thinkers, spanning different eras, different perspectives.
And it's important to get that these commentaries, they aren't just casual thoughts. They're rigorous engagements trying to unlock the deeper meaning.
Definitely. And right from the get-go, these commentaries raise some, well, really fascinating questions.
Right.
Like, why is God called Elohim, God, here in chapter 1, instead of the Tetragrammaton, Lord, which you often see linked with creation later on?
Good point.
And what exactly got created in the beginning? Was it heaven and earth first, or
something else. And the angels.
right?
Yeah.
Where are they? They're huge in Jewish cosmology, but not mentioned right here at the start.
Yeah.
Interesting omission, isn't it?
It really is. Okay, so with those questions kind of hanging there, let's jump into the very first word. Bereshit, usually translated in the beginning.
And Rashi, the towering 11th century commentator, he gives us two main ways to understand this.
Okay, what's the first?
First is a midrashic view. He suggests creation happened for the sake of Reshit,
Reshit meaning
beginning or first, but here referring specifically to Torah and Israel. He connects it to Proverbs, Torah as the beginning of his course, and Jeremiah, Israel as the first fruits of his harvest.
Wow, so that reading really emphasizes Israel's connection to the land, to God's whole plan, right from word 1.
Exactly. It grounds it theologically.
Yeah.
But Rashi also offers a more, let's say, straightforward grammatical take.
Right.
He suggests translating it at the beginning of God's creating.
At the beginning of. Why the of?
His point is grammatical. In Hebrew, Bereshit is in a construct form, like saying the King of England. The first word depends on the second.
Okay.
So Rashi argues this structure implies heaven and earth weren't necessarily the absolute first things created. There might have been something before, or the act of creating itself was the focus.
And he points to the water, right, in verse 2?
Exactly. He notes the water seems to pre-exist. The text doesn't say God created the water on day 1.
That's fascinating. The idea that maybe water was there before the 6 days we usually think of?
Now, Rashbam, who was actually Rashi's grandson, he jumps on this pre-existing water point too, but uses it to critique the standard "in the beginning God created" translation even more directly.
Oh, so?
Rashbam argues Bereshit always means at the beginning of, pointing to other places in the Bible like Genesis 10:10, the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom.
Okay, got it.
So for Rashbam, the creation story starts after an initial state that already included water. It wasn't creation purely ex nihilo, out of nothing, at that precise moment.
So both Rashi and Rashbam see the water issue, but draw slightly different conclusions about the first phrase. Interesting. What about Ibn Ezra?
Ibn Ezra, another giant from the 12th century, he zooms in on the preposition in the by part of Bereshit.
Okay.
He discusses whether it's essential or maybe, just idiomatic. He looks at the vowel points under the letter, suggesting in the beginning might not capture it perfectly.
He gets really technical, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. And he disagrees that Bereshit always needs an of after it, giving examples like in Deuteronomy where it stands alone. They're like, linguistic detectives here.
They really are. Okay, and then Kimhi, another perspective.
Yep. Kimhi, writing a bit later, argues that beginning here is absolute. Like in Isaiah, I foretell the end from the beginning.
So he actually supports the common translation, in the beginning God created.
He does. His reasoning is quite cool. He says time itself only began with the movement of the celestial spheres. So beginning marks the absolute start of time.
Whoa, okay. Linking creation to the very birth of time itself. That's a big concept.
It is. Now, Nachmanides, a major Kabbalist, he brings a whole other dimension.
I bet he does.
He strongly disagrees with Rashi, citing Rabbi Isaac, who apparently suggested the Torah didn't need to start with creation. For Nachmanides, creation is the root of faith. period.
So it's fundamental.
Absolutely. He sees the whole creation count as a deep mystery, something concealed in the text, understood only through tradition traced back to Moses.
A mystical understanding.
Very much so. He connects the Midrash about Bereshit to the Kabbalistic concept of Chokmah, divine wisdom, suggesting creation itself stems from this primordial divine intelligence.
So it's not just history, it's encoded mystical teaching for him.
Precisely. And what about Abarbanel, who we mentioned earlier? What were his questions on this first word?
Right, Abarbanel, always with the questions.
Yeah. Regarding Bereshit, he asks why use Elohim, God, instead of the Tetragrammaton, Lord, since the prophets often link the Tetragrammaton to creation. And he emphasizes that Genesis 1 is actively arguing against philosophical ideas floating around at the time, like the idea that matter was eternal, or denying creation ex nihilo.
So the choice of words, the opening statement, it's making specific theological points right away.
According to Abarbanel, yes. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Verse 2, the state of the earth, Tohu VaVohu, unformed and void.
How does Rashi explain that? It sounds pretty bleak.
He translates it as astonishment and desolation. It really paints a picture of utter emptiness, chaos.
Yeah.
And he adds that the deep mentioned is the water above the yet unformed earth.
A watery chaos. What about Rashbam?
Rashbam also sees it as complete desolation. He pulls in verses from Jeremiah. I looked on the earth, and behold, it was waste and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. Powerful stuff.
Yeah, really desolate imagery.
For him, it's just this state of utter nothingness covering the earth that somehow already existed.
Okay. Does Ibn Ezra connect Tohu with Tehum, the deep? They sound similar.
He actually argues against that,
Yeah.
grammatically. He mentions a mystical interpretation from the Sefer Yetzirah about green lines and slimy stones.
Okay, a bit obscure.
Yeah, but Ibn Ezra himself prefers the straightforward Aramaic translation by Onkelos, unformed and void. For him, it just means the world was totally underwater, with earth naturally sunk beneath the water.
A water world, basically. Kimhi's view is similar, isn't it?
It is. Kimhi thinks the earth was created incomplete, unlike the heavens, and just totally covered in water, waiting to be formed.
Right. And then Nachmanides, back to Kabbalah.
You guessed it. He sees Tohu as the primordial, formless substance, the Greek hyle, and Bohu as the forms that matter takes on.
So like potential and actuality.
Sort of. He links it to Isaiah and Sefer Yetzirah again.
Yeah.
And for him, earth here isn't just dirt, it's all four elements. Earth, air, fire, water, all mixed up.
A primordial soup of elements. And Abarbanel's questions here.
Yes, what does unformed and void actually mean? And interestingly, another commentator, Bekor Shor, apparently warned against asking too much about what this void was. Like, it's a mystery, maybe we shouldn't probe too deeply.
A sense of awe, maybe. Okay, let's look at the Ruach Elohim, the wind or spirit of God moving over the water. Rashi's take.
Rashi gives that beautiful midrashic image. God's throne of glory hovering over the water, still like a dove over its nest.
Hovering. How?
Powered by a wind from God's own mouth, his command. It's this image of active divine presence.
Really evocative. Rashbam sees the wind differently, though, right? More like foreshadowing.
Exactly. He sees it hinting at the waters gathering later in verse 9, and even connects it to the wind splitting the Red Sea in Exodus.
Ah, linking creation to redemption history.
Yeah, a neat connection.
And Ibn Ezra. He sees it as an agent of God.
Pretty much. A spirit sent to do God's will, specifically to start drying up the water. More functional.
Okay. Kimhi finds a dual meaning here.
He does. He says, Ruach Elohim can mean both God's will, the spirit aspect, and a mighty wind. He points out that in Hebrew, adding El or Yah can mean great or mighty.
Like mountains of God means huge mountains.
Exactly. So it's both divine intent and a powerful physical force.
Bridging the gap. And Nachmanides, back to the elements.
Yep. For him, this wind is simply the element of air fitting into his four-element model.
Okay. And Abarbanel, he connects it to angels.
He interprets it, interestingly, as a rational spirit, maybe even the separate intelligences from philosophy, linking it to angels as God's messengers who move the spheres, citing Psalm 104.
Wow, so interpretations run from literal wind to divine breath to cosmic intelligences. Amazing range.
It really shows the depth. All right, next up, the creation of light, verse 3. God said.
Ibn Ezra focuses on that phrase, God said.
Yeah, he takes it literally. God speaks, and it happens. Effortless creation. Like a king giving an order.
Divine command. But Kimhi suggests the light wasn't exactly newly created right then.
Correct. Kimhi thinks light, like all elements, was created in the initial instant with the heavens. but it only became effective on Earth on day one.
So it existed, but its effects started then.
Kind of, yeah. It was present, but its interaction with Earth began on its designated day.
Okay. Nachmanides sees God said differently again, more like intention.
Exactly, like divine will or thought, no effort needed. Let there be light means God intended part of the primordial heaven stuff to become light.
And he notes something's missing, right?
Yes. The phrase, "and it was so." It's there for other days, but not right after "let there be light." Nachmanides suggests this initial light didn't stay in its original state.
That's subtle. Maybe it was a different kind of light.
Maybe. And Abarbanel, predictably, asks about the nature of this light and why it doesn't say God made light and about that missing, "and it was so."
Always questioning. And Gersonides had a radical idea about this light.
Yeah, Gersonides, another philosopher, suggested this first light was actually the world of angels and pure intellect.
A metaphysical light. Wow, okay, verse 4. God separates light from darkness. Rashi gives two explanations.
He does. The Midrashic one is lovely. God saw the light was so good, he set it aside for the righteous in the world to come.
Separated for a future purpose.
Right. And the simpler explanation. He saw light and darkness shouldn't just be mixed up randomly, so he assigned them distinct times, day and night. Cosmic order.
Establishing the basic rhythm. Rashbam focuses on the literal meaning.
Yeah, good. And he emphasizes the order. First 12 hours day, next 12 night. Light came first. Darkness as night followed as the absence of that created light.
Okay. Ibn Ezra gets a bit metaphorical here with God's seeing.
Yeah, he interprets God's saw as God's thought, and separated as meaning distinguish them by giving them names, day and night.
And he had that idea about the light starting dim.
Right, like a cloudy day, gradually getting stronger over the next few days, an evolving light.
Interesting. But Nachmanides wasn't keen on interpreting God's seeing quite so literally.
No, he criticized Rashi and Ibn Ezra for, anthropomorphizing God.
Yeah.
For Nachmanides, seeing in creation means God maintaining existence through his will. If he stopped seeing it, it would vanish.
Wow, that's intense. Continuous creation.
Exactly. And he distinguishes the good of light from the very good of the whole creation later. For him, darkness is just the absence of the created light. God made light in a limited measure, which leads to the day-night cycle.
So darkness isn't a separate creation, just a result of light's limits. Makes sense. And Abarbanel's questions.
He asks why single out light as good, and what's the exact link between God seeing light was good and then separating it, probing the logic.
Okay, which brings us to naming day and night in verse 5, and Abarbanel's question about evening and morning and why one day, not first day.
Right, Rashi tackles one day first.
What's his take?
He says it means a day of the one, emphasizing God's absolute unity and solitude before the angels were created on day 2.
Highlighting God's uniqueness at the start. Powerful. Rashbam.
Rashbam sees day and night as just referring back to the light darkness of day 1. And evening and morning simply marks the transition and completion of that first 24-hour cycle. Evening fades, morning dawns, day 1 is done.
Makes sense. Ibn Ezra looks at the words themselves. Evening and morning.
Yeah, etymology again. Evening, from the root for mix or blend when things get indistinct. Morning, for when shapes become clear again.
Clever.
And he takes one day as one full rotation of the celestial sphere, which implies evening or night comes before morning, the daytime part.
The Jewish day starting at sunset.
Exactly. And he throws in that midrash about the world lasting 6,000 years, 1 millennium per creation day.
Connecting the micro to the macro. Kimhi.
Similar descriptions of evening, morning. His reason for one day is simple logic. You can't have a first until there's a second to compare it to.
Straightforward enough. And Nachmanides sees the naming itself as crucial.
Very. Naming day and night as the creation of time and its measures. He reads evening and morning as constituting an evening and a morning of one day, stressing the unity and uniqueness of that first day. No comparison possible yet.
Right, no second yet. Okay, day 2. The expanse, or firmament, verse 6. Abarbanel asks, wait, didn't verse 1 say God created the heaven? Why an expanse now?
Good question. Rashi explains the heavens created on day 1 were like fluid. They didn't solidify until day 2 with God's command for the expanse. He cites Job about the pillars of heaven trembling.
So it gave structure.
Structure and separation. Rashi says the expanse sits between the upper waters and the lower waters, with the upper waters miraculously held up by God's word.
Wow. Rashbam sees it as more solid.
Yeah, solid barrier separating upper and lower waters. And that's why for Rashbam, God doesn't say it was good On day 2, the work with water wasn't finished until the dry land appeared on day 3.
Delaying the good until the job was done. Ibn Ezra.
He connects the Hebrew word for expanse, rakia, to stretching out, like stretching a tent. He thinks the expanse is actually the air.
The air, how?
He even suggests maybe the initial light created a dry wind and the light's energy turned the air to this expanse. Sounds almost scientific.
A bit. Nachmanides, though, connects it back to the start.
Always. He says the formless matter from verse 1 was transformed by God's command into this expanse, stretched out within the waters. He mentions other rabbis thinking it was hardened water or a kind of shell.
Still mystical?
Very. He stresses it's a concealed meaning in the Torah.
And Abarbanel also asks why God had to make the expanse after saying, "Let there be." It sounds redundant.
Right, echoing Ben Zoma's famous challenge, why the extra step compared to other days? Maimonides hints Ben Zoma maybe understood something deeper, some secret meaning in that repetition.
The precision of the language again. Every word matters. Okay, finally for today, verse 8. Naming the expanse sky, or heaven. Abarbanel's question. If it's made of water, why call it heaven? Shamayim.
Rashi gives a few fascinating etymologies for shamayim. Maybe Samaim carries water, or Shemayim water is there.
Makes sense?
Or even Eshumayim, fire and water, miraculously combined by God.
Fire and water, wow. Rashbam's point about naming.
He says naming just means God consistently calls it sky from then on in the Torah, and he distinguishes this sky from the heaven of heavens mentioned elsewhere, suggesting different levels.
Multiple heavens. Ibn Ezra.
Simple observation. God named 5 things before humans: light, darkness, heaven, earth, seas. Divine order.
Categorization.
Kimhi. He sees the expanse as a dome stretched over the earth, similar in function to the higher heavens, hence the name sky.
The dome idea, and Nachmanides gives the most detailed distinction, doesn't it?
He does. The heaven in verse 1, for him, is the upper spiritual heaven beyond the physical spheres, created ex nihilo.
Out of nothing.
Right. The sky, named on day 2, made from water, is the physical heaven we see, named after that original spiritual one. He again discusses shamayim, possibly meaning which is water, or another name for water.
So a physical sky named after a spiritual heaven.
Exactly. It emphasizes this mystical idea of levels, heaven above heaven, throne above throne, a complex cosmology.
Wow. We've really only scratched the surface of these first 8 verses, haven't we? But the sheer richness, the depth that comes out when you look through these commentaries, it's incredible.
It really is. You see them grappling with just the biggest questions imaginable. What is creation? What is God like? How did the physical and spiritual relate? What does it all mean?
And it's not just one answer. So many perspectives across centuries.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it's really just a taste, isn't it? A glimpse into this huge ocean of Jewish thought on Genesis.
Absolutely. So for you, our listener, the learner, if this has sparked your curiosity, and how could it not, I'd definitely explore these commentators more. There's just so much wisdom there.
There really is. And maybe just a final thought to leave you with. Considering all these different ways of understanding the very first moments, the arguments, the mysteries, the interpretations, how might that ongoing conversation about the beginning shape how we see our own place in the universe, our connection to the divine?
What does it mean that the absolute beginning is still, after all this time, a subject of such intense, diverse, and frankly profound discussion?
Something to ponder.